Another way of using the word archetype is to say pattern. All phenomena follows a pattern. We as human beings, we follow a pattern. The pattern of the human waltz, as I call it, is usually birth, infancy, young person, middle age, autumn of our days, elderhood, and then the passing of the body-mind. That's the usual and simplest terms of describing the general human life, though the pattern or the archetypical journey isn't always like that. We might elsewhere use this word journey, the inevitable, it's all a journey, but also it's a movement through the human experience, I like to say. What does that look like in terms of archetypal patterns? Well, the archetypal pattern is for all of us to see. It somewhat describes why Hollywood keeps making the same films over and over again, because there's an archetypal pattern of telling the same story. Whether we're telling the story of Jesus in the Bible, whether we're telling the story of the Buddha, whether we're telling the growth story of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, and whether even we look at Muhammad's story of infancy, development, realization, transfiguration, elderhood and death. Whether we look at the Luke Skywalker story, really good telling of that, or the Lensman in manga, in anime stories, or whether we look at the story of our neighbours or our neighbours' children or the neighbours with which we grew up, and more than anything, whether we look at our own story. We're all bound by that archetypal pattern, though we might try to fight it, and please feel free to do so. And that pattern looks a lot like being born and being conditioned by our family, given the beliefs from the time frame in history, being born out of generations of what worked and generations of difficulty, and a lineage for life that we've come through, a genetic makeup that we're all very interested in discovering now, and we assume that all of that is good, but obviously a lot of what we uncover, some of what we uncover, might come from terrible groups and tribes over the ages where we've sought to navigate the globe and dominate others. So be careful what you pray for there. We're schooled and we're conditioned. We move out into the world, into relationships and the workplace, and we try and stamp meaning into the experience of what it's like to be me and seeing the world from this perspective. And then we begin to encounter items like illness, difficulty, struggle and suffering. We experience grief as the elders from our tribe pass, as the archetypal pattern moves on. And we overcome these difficulties. We hit the wall. We are out in the desert for 30 days and 30 nights. Or we are trained in elderhood and wisdom teaching, and then we embody that wisdom teaching, and we come to the fullness of our being, and we find spiritual, emotional, or psychological or material success, and we are in the heyday of our days. Perhaps we reach middle age. Middle age, I'm told now, is characterized by being between the ages of 36 and 55, I believe. So being 56 next year, I'm no longer middle-aged. So I don't know whether I'm older age or whether there's some new bracket that I fit into as a body, at least, anyway. And then we are, perhaps we're parenting, or perhaps we're financially secure, or perhaps we're finding ourselves in terms of a midlife crisis, whatever that might be. The realization that our patterns for the first half of life aren't going to be sufficient to move us to the next place, to the next level, or out of this current difficulty that we're going through, whatever that might be: ill health, loss of someone we love, unemployment, living with the wounds and the repercussions of how we lived in younger life. It's just one of many examples, of course. And then we descend through the dark night of the soul. We have to grieve that loss of who we once were. We grieve youth. We grieve our hopes and the plans and who we once imagined we might become, as we imagined vast empires or terribly imagined terrible suffering that's now come to call and claim us. but we fall into a dark night of the soul. Now, if we allow this difficulty and struggle that we're going through as we reach middle age, and of course, we don't have to reach middle age or elder age to go through struggle and suffering. But should we do so, we might be transformed by allowing the difficulties of that fall through the dark night of the soul to take us to another place, to be confronted with larger questions about life. Perhaps, though not always. This is why we often find that it is men who reach middle age and the rug is pulled under them from life, from how they were once living. Their plans and programs haven't come to fruition, or life collapses as it currently is or always has been, and the tools we learnt in our family and our school and our time framing culture are gone. Perhaps our time has passed. Perhaps that sense of the dying and the moving away from youthfulness and energy and exuberance and feeling invincible and wanting it all and having it all and seeking it all, though never having any of it, perhaps, has caught up with us. And we are being called to the second half of life, or the deeper way of being, or eldership and wisdom, and such beautiful terms like that. So we can either be transformed by that fall into asking larger questions, or we can quit the race, which is why the statistics for suicide, certainly in the UK, the highest are those of men in that age, around that age 35 to 50 somewhere. And then there is the autumn of our days, of course, and there's a happiness that appeared for myself at 40 that's been embodied ever since, despite difficulty, tragedy and trauma since then, that each of which has, though seemed to have overwhelmed at the time, belonged to a bigger story and a bigger narrative. And so even though I was overwhelmed by the experiences I've been through since the age of 40, at times completely falling apart, there wasn't a sense of being able to give up. There was nothing to give up to, whatever giving up means. When we're young, we're so apt to cry, I give up, I can't do this anymore. And then, of course, we're still there. We're still here. And then the next thing appears. I think there's been an embodiment of that after the age of 40 and reaching 50 and going through quite difficult trauma at that time, around the body and around this perception of where one's place was in the scheme of things, and beginning to ask questions about death and dying and mortality and being confronted with that through that same trauma, and having to ask the most adult questions and moving from trying to become somebody to beginning to entertain the idea of finally becoming nobody, and seeing that this is all part of the same archetypal movement, the pattern, the movement of the Christ, the movement of Luke Skywalker, the movement of the Buddha, and so on, and the movement of the guy down the road and the movement of myself, as we've said. Now here I am at 55, perhaps I'll reach 60, who knows, we don't know. We don't know what happens tomorrow, in the next minute, we don't know what happens when the body and the mind is finished within this place. There may or may not be something, none of us really know. We like to apply belief and we like to speculate. That's as much as we can really say, and we can speculate and believe in all manner of things. Feel free. But here I am, 55, perhaps I'll reach 60, and that is clearly a time of beginning to embody eldership, become an elder. What will I do with that? I don't know. One would be apt to think positively about that. Perhaps these attempts to record pocketbook wisdom and thoughts and reflections about a life lived thus far are an attempt to begin to entertain the idea of eldership. You can be the judge of whether it has any value for you. The value it offers me is sitting with my recording device, opening my mouth and organically, spontaneously speaking to see what comes, which is, right now, is just a description of the very thing that's happening. So like a congruent statement, that's about as wise as it gets. But also an attempt to articulate the archetypal story from this apparent perspective. Perhaps it will be of use, perhaps not. Time will tell. The thing I do know about eldership and wisdom is that I won't be there to see whether it has value or not. And that's okay. It's absolutely okay. This is to have learnt from the times when I've had to entertain, as I've got older, ideas of death and dying and no longer being here. And as I've said elsewhere, the idea that not only one day will I be forgotten, but all the people that have attempted to remember me will have died, and they too will be forgotten. Because in the end, the archetypal story is one of forgetfulness, is one of irrelevance. As Gandhi said, everything we do will be irrelevant, but then we still must do it. So here we are, doing a recording.